Telecast.
Hi, I'm Justin Crosby, and welcome back to a new season of Telecast. I hope you've all had a great summer. The first show in Season 7 comes from the recent Edinburgh TV Festival, where I caught up with Nutopia's Jane Root, ITV's Bhav Chandrani, and All3 Media International's Nick Smith, as we chatted through some of the key talking points raised at the event, including how to survive the TV downturn, the outlook for brand-funded programming, and the success of the Traitors. It's all coming up on this week's Telecast. So my first guest on this week's Edinburgh TV Festival special episode of Telecast is Nick Smith, EVP of Formats and Licensing at All3 Media International. Nick, great to see you.
Great to see you too. Thanks for having me on.
Not at all. Great to finally get to sit down and have a chat with you, because I've seen you at various European destinations, touring around the world, promoting and doing deals for the Traitors, which is obviously a real breakout international format success. The show, if everybody hasn't seen it, I'm sure everybody has, but it's set in a castle and it sees a group of faithful sniff out the Traitors every day whilst competing in challenges and building up prize money. Tell us a little bit about the session yesterday, Nick, because it was a really well attended session. I think it was standing room only pretty much. Tell us about who was on the panel and what you got to discuss in it.
Yeah, so on the panel we had Jasper Hockendorn. I pronounce his name wrongly all the time, but I always like to do it because it makes him laugh. Who's the creative director of IDTV in the Netherlands, who came up with the idea for the Traitors a good 7 years ago now. It took him a while until 2021 to get it on air in the Netherlands. So he was there talking about the journey. We had two of the broadcasters that have had great success with the format. We had Saida from the BBC and Sharon from NBC, which is really interesting because they're very different broadcasters, BBC being public service, obviously NBC being commercial, and actually NBC aired it on Peacock, their VOD platform, so worked for kind of two opposite types of broadcasters. Had Stephen Lambert on there, who is the chief executive of Studio Lambert, who produced both the UK and US versions of the show very successfully, and Alyssa, who was one of the Traitors in the first UK series, who gave some fantastic insights to what it was like actually being on the show and not really knowing what to expect, and me, who didn't offer much at all. But no, it was a really good panel, really, really fun.
Let's talk a little bit about the Traitors and this remarkable journey. You mentioned that format's been in existence for about 7 years, but I guess over in the last 2 years, it's really exploded around the world. So take us back to the Netherlands and IDTV, and who was the first commissioned by, and how did it then spin out, and how did you get involved?
So it's something that I'd known about for a number of years. Jasper had been talking to me about the idea and saying, look, I think there's something in this. And he pitched various versions of it to me. And I was always interested, but I didn't feel he quite grasped it. At one stage, it was called The Mutineers, which, you could never really imagine as being a big format title around the world. And it was set on a boat. But the core concept of it, there was something interesting in it. And he kept digging away at it, and he was speaking to RTL about it for a long period of time, trying to convince them, and they were interested but just not quite ready to commit to it.
And IDTV is part of All3 Media International.
Yeah, they are. They're our Dutch production company. And what really made a difference is that they I guess you could made a pilot of it, which is they just, for those that know the format, there's the kind of the central part of the format is the round table, where all the contestants sit around a round table and basically make accusations and defend themselves from accusations of being a traitor. And they played that with the core commissioning team at RTL, and just without any reality, just chose some traitors, and it caused arguments, and it was electric. And that's when RTL were really convinced there was something in it, and they decided to give it a go. I mean, it really helped because the commission came during the pandemic, and some of the shows that were successful for RTL, it was challenging to film. Things like Survivor, you couldn't really go and film, although the idea was to film the Traitors in a castle in Scotland. The Dutch guys couldn't travel to Scotland, so they filmed in a castle in the Netherlands, and yeah, it was a huge success from episode 1.
Do you think that the show was being commissioned was a benefit, if you like, of being in COVID? Do you think it? I know you're going to say yes, it would have been commissioned anyway, but do you think that it helped bring it to market sooner, maybe than it would have done otherwise?
I mean, there was always interest because they were talking about it for such a long period of time, but sometimes you just need that reason to go now, and I think that helped. That okay, well, we can record this. This is a show that we can record during the pandemic, during the COVID restrictions. So I'm sure that had a big impact on, okay, let's do this, let's go. Yeah.
The BBC version was shot in Scotland, in a castle in Scotland, but you're saying originally the Dutch version, but that was the plan for that show as well. Why in Scotland?
Just actually, Jasper talks about the fact that he was just thinking about castles, and Scotland felt, that's a nation of castles. Actually, I think he was thinking a little bit about Edinburgh Castle, which you could never shoot the Traitors there, but, not knowing it particularly well, he started in his mind developing the show would be shot around Edinburgh.
I believe it's now in its 7th series in the Netherlands. Who was the first other country to pick the show up internationally, and how did that create a domino effect that we've seen?
It went to Belgium next. They very quickly commissioned it, and then they were on air pretty quickly as well. Again, it was a success there, and it's come back. I think they've done now 3 seasons, so that was a success. I would say that, but the kind of next kind of really big territory was France, and it was a breakout success for M6, being their kind of biggest entertainment launch since Big Brother, 20 years ago, which was a different world when you didn't have so many channels, the internet wasn't such a thing. So, to kind of get to that level was, for a new series, was really unheard of. And that's, I think, when lots of people around the world really started to take notice. And
we've seen now, I think, 26 deals, I think, has been publicised. I know that you described Yes as the fastest selling format in the world at present. How many of those 26 have aired so far, and how many of those are options? Do you know off the top of your head?
None of those are options. We only ever discuss the commissioned shows, so they're all going to series or have launched. We've got a few of those 26 that haven't launched yet. So, for example, we have Finland and Sweden and Germany all due to launch in September. But at the moment, we have New Zealand that's just gone on air, Denmark that's just gone on air, both to big success. I need to look for some wood to touch, because at the moment, everywhere it's working and coming back, I'm not naive enough to think that everywhere, even the biggest shows and the biggest format hits, there will be some territories where they don't work. So I'm sure that will happen to us. But at the moment, it seems to be doing the job in every type of country, and for every type of channel, from public service to VOD platform to commercial.
A successful format is really about tapping into some form of common humanity that people are feeling. What do you think is the real secret sauce here?
I think there's a few things to it. I think, first of all, it feels really original. It breaks a lot of rules. So, for example, the audience know who the Traitors are. From the first episode, you find out who the Traitors are, and the rest of the contestants in the show do not know, and the audience are in on it. And that kind of goes against the rules, especially what's been successful in recent years. Things like The Masked Singer, it's all about, play along. You need to keep the audience guessing. You want to have them commenting online who the Traitors are. The opposite is true in this. It's about, you kind of know what's going on, and you've got a head start on the contestants, and you're thinking, why didn't they spot that? And it's a very different way of watching a show. It's also produced in a really different way. Most reality shows are quite heavily produced. Producers are talking to the contestants all the time, and they're hyping them up, suggesting that they might want to do things here and there. We have to be very careful in producing the Traitors that there's really no interaction, as little as possible interaction between the producers and the contestants, because it's such a psychological game. Anything that producers say, it changes how contestants play the game, and they blame, for example, a contestant may come to a producer and say, are Traitors allowed to do X? The producer will never answer that question. They will just say, go and read the rule book. That we've learned that anything that you say, people go, the producer just told me this, and then they think that
they come to different conclusions based upon a response from one of the producers.
So it's really kind of going against your instincts as a producer that you don't produce. You just trust the format and let people play the game how they wish to play the game. Yeah.
In terms of local productions, are most, if not all, of the local productions being made by all three businesses, or is there some non-all three production companies locally making those?
There's quite a lot of non-all three production companies making the format. All three are based in UK, US, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium and New Zealand. So other than outside of that, it's been produced by all types of companies, and we work with everyone. So we have Banijay, Fremantle producing some of the versions, as well as independent production companies.
The second season has been commissioned in the US. Is that again with Alan Cumming as the host?
Correct. Yes.
And Claudia Winkleman has had remarkable success as being the host in the UK. Are we seeing similar success for hosts as well in these successful territories? Because it's a very different role, isn't it, than we've perhaps seen it for a presenter of a show.
Yeah, and I think there's a real opportunity for presenters to make the show their own. A lot of the big hit formats, the presenter has to act a certain way. And I still remember there's a great tape from years ago from The Weakest Link where you see all the different presenters around the world and they all look just like Anne Robinson and they all have that same kind of stern.
The format was actually the image of the presenter.
Yeah. But when you look at the presenters of the Traitors all around the world, they're so different and varied. Like the French presenter is very eccentric and animated. The Spanish is really cool. The New Zealand host is a really famous New Zealand presenter, but he had decided not to do a lot on TV for ages. And this is his comeback. And for your British audience, I'd describe him as maybe having a personality similar to Jack Dee. So you can imagine the difference between him and somebody like Claudia, the way they present the show. It feels completely different. So it's fascinating to watch the different versions of the show because they have such a different tone depending on who the host is.
So, Nick, you've been travelling all around the world, as I said, with the Traitors, and it's been keeping you incredibly busy. Do you have time to work on any other shows at the moment when you're overseeing the rollout of this show internationally? Anything else you're working on?
Yeah, I from 6 p.m. till 10 p.m. every night. That's when I don't do the Traitors and I work on the other show. No, I'm just joking. Yeah, no, we're really blessed to have a strong catalogue. So there's, now that the world's reopened, Race Across the World is doing really well for us internationally. We have IDTV's latest show, The Unknown, which launched recently in the Netherlands really successfully. So those are getting a lot of interest. But a new show that will be launching for MIPCOM that I'm really excited about is been announced by Channel 4 as Alan Must Win. Like the Traitors, it kind of breaks a lot of the reality rules, and it sees a panel of celebrities manipulating a reality show to see if they can make one non-typical reality contestant win a popularity contest. So that one, it's really good. I'm super excited about it.
All right, well, we'll keep our eyes peeled for that. Nick, thank you very much for coming on telecast. It's been really interesting hearing about the success of the Traitors, and good luck with all the new rollouts, and all the best with your new shows.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for having me.
My next guest on this week's show is Bhav Chandrani, Director, Digital and Creative Partnerships at ITV. Bhav, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm really well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Tell us about your role at ITV, because you're obviously much more on the branded content and partnership side, perhaps an area that producers might not have the opportunity to work with you as much as the traditional commissioning side.
Sure. So I'm part of ITV Commercial, which is a division within the media and entertainment side of the business, so the broadcast and streaming part of ITV. We make money through advertising across ITV's network of channels, platforms, across content that we distribute. And there are essentially three types of revenue. There's advertising, which is the linear part. There's VOD, which is the ITVX part. And then there's kind of everything else, which is my part. And that's kind of more creative versions of advertising. So from sponsorship through to product placement, through to licensing, how a brand might use a show IP in their world, through to how we monetize on social platforms. So there's quite a breadth to my role.
In reality, what that might mean is sponsored sections on daytime shows, for example, as well as actual creating branded content series?
Yes, so the heartland of what we do, the mature part of what we do is sponsorship, and that's sponsorship of shows principally, but it could be sponsorship of a genre. So Cooper sponsor mystery drama, could be sponsorship of a channel. So ITVB is sponsored by Tesco F&F. So things like that. And that's the heartland of what we do, and that's driven by our USP is delivering mass audiences to the heart of popular culture. But then alongside that, we have what we call bespoke partnerships, which is where we create additional partnerships, often around shows. So Love Island's a great example where we have eBay as a headline sponsor, but we have 7 other partners on the most recent series, ranging from Boots as a beauty partner, Google Pixel as the handset partner, through to Subway, who are the lunch partner. So we create kind of tiered partnerships around key verticals that we can identify within a show. But we also create partnerships around our channel IP. So a really great example recently was Samsung with ITV on Saturday nights, where we created some bespoke ads using Fleur East and Ollie Murs.
And when it comes to your biggest properties, obviously there's more opportunity to have more tiers, if you like. Do all of those partners receive on-screen branding within the editorial of the show, or are we talking more about specific bumpers, for example?
That's a great question. So the headline sponsor is the one who gets the bumpers around the show. So sticking with the Love Island example, that's eBay. And then in terms of the other partners, it all varies based on who they are, what the Ofcom regulations do or don't allow, and what works editorially, very importantly, of course. So somebody like Boots can appear in show because we product place their kind of range of beauty products, so that in particular their sun lotions, things like that, are quite visible on screen, whereas somebody like WKD, because of restrictions around product placement for alcohol, will appear in the ad space around the show, borrowing IP, maybe using ex-Islanders who have left the show to appear in an ad copy that sits around it. They'll appear less. What's becoming increasingly important for brands is there'll be a start point to the campaign, which will be either be in the show or around the show, but it's building an ecosystem around that allows the partnership to live and breathe far beyond the kind of boundaries of the show itself. So creating lots of social assets, digital assets that they can utilize, creating bespoke content that might sit on the brand's kind of platforms, right through to use of IP, as I mentioned. So that might be creating in-store beauty boxes like Boots did. It might be creating a kind of special area within their app or website like eBay have done.
Without going into any detail, how does that revenue share work with the producer, for example? Do they all get a share of those deals that you're doing right across all these tiers?
So the core of what we do, the sponsorship part, is kind of built into our business model. So the bumpers that sit around the show on both linear and streaming, for that bit we retain 100% of the revenue. However, increasingly, the sponsorships that we do are 360 and feature elements of product placement or licensing or digital. And for those elements, we do agree rev shares with producers, whether that's internal producers across ITV studios or whether that's third-party producers. And we've worked really effectively with the likes of Lime, Banijay, Bandicoot, Fremantle, just as a couple of examples, where we're able to drive incremental revenue for all parties.
Any sort of revenue is on everybody's lips at the moment, because we're obviously here at Edinburgh TV Festival in, pretty tough times for the TV industry. One of the reasons for that is obviously the ad crisis that we've been talking about on telecast right throughout this year. So the obvious question, first of all, is how is the ad crisis affecting your business in terms of not only those sponsorships and those different tiers that we're talking about? Are advertisers looking at TV in a different way in the current marketplace, or are they increasing spend in particular areas? Or give us a sense of how you're experiencing the downturn right now.
Sure. I think it's a real mixed economy. It varies very much depending on sector, brand, kind of what's going on in their micro market. Of course, we're all kind of suffering from the overarching cost of living crisis, and that has had an impact on advertising overall, but I think it is tailored to what each brand is trying to achieve and their specific objectives. I will say we had a bit of a tougher time around sponsorship earlier in the year, and sometimes sponsorship can be a bit of a bellwether for how the rest of the ad market's going to be impacted, because we're working with slightly longer time frames than perhaps traditional advertising. So that was a bit of an indicator of what might come. I would say that currently, if not buoyant, we feel pretty optimistic about where partnerships is at as we're coming to the end of this year and going into next year. We've had some great partnerships which we haven't yet announced that have been done in the last couple of months. We're kind of going through what we call our renewal season at the moment, so looking at 2024. Like I say, if not buoyant, we're feeling cautiously optimistic about how things might look as we head into next year.
Yeah, and some of the headline figures I've been looking at recently seem to suggest a bit of an upturn when we're coming into 2024, and that's presumably what you're seeing as well.
Partnerships is slightly ahead of the rest of the ad market, so I'm not saying that we know for sure how the whole ad market's going to perform. I think there's still a fair bit of uncertainty as we finish this year. But from a partnerships point of view, yes, I would say it feels like there are good indicators as we reach the end of this year. Ask me again in 2 or 3 months and I'll have even better idea of how things feel.
I might take you up on that, Bhav. Much of the conversation around Edinburgh TV Festival is particularly in the unscripted area, but also for different reasons, we're seeing issues within the scripted sector as well, due to no small part the strikes that are happening in the US at the moment. But the unscripted sectors has really had a challenging year so far. And there's been a real slowdown in commissioning right across the board. And we've been finding that in conversations that we've had on the show with lots of international producers as well. We're now looking at producers, they may be looking to other areas rather than their traditional commissioning models to make their shows and sell their shows to broadcasters. Specifically around brand-funded programming, how's that been performing over the last few months for you?
Brand-funded programming is a really important growth area for us. But I would say that it's quite a slow one to assess. So it's quite hard to give a view based on the last couple of months or so on. So we've definitely seen a growth in interest in this area over the last 3 to 5 years from brands, first of all, but increasingly as a potential model for how to make the schedule work harder for us. It definitely feels like there's a swell which is coming to say, let's look at this as a model that we can utilize more frequently. From a brand's point of view, it feels very much about how do you create impact as a brand? How do you become part of culture? How can you develop social currency is increasingly important. So brands are looking at it as a potential solution for some of their kind of core business objectives, to tell an interesting story about their brand, to try and develop a different type of conversation with their potential consumers that is slightly slower and longer form. So I think brands are looking at kind of potentially production of content for that reason. And then for us as a business, we're just looking at if we could get X slot funded, does that then free up money that we can put into another slot somewhere else? Or given we've now got this infinite shop store with ITVX. We've grown the volume of content, the number of hours we've got available on ITVX enormously over the last 18 months. How can we continue to provide content and fuel the desire for increasing amounts of content within ITVX? And so could we work with brands to take more risks, to try and identify new content genres that we might be able to commission for ITVX that we might not be able to on linear. So we're just looking at all of that world, and it's quite nascent, but we do see it as a growth opportunity.
And I suppose it's worth considering that when brands are looking at brand-funded content, they're looking about emotional communication, aren't they, with their audiences for their brand, not necessarily an individual product. So this is a much longer-term part of their strategy often, isn't it?
I think that's absolutely right, especially given the timelines that you're often having to work with to produce a show. So you have to have a brand who's got that kind of longer term vision. That said, there can also be key product briefs that kind of come through that hit the nail on the head for a specific need at that point in time. I can't think of any examples right off the top of my head. So you get a variety, and it does depend on kind of what a brand is trying to achieve. And for us, from the brand side of things, is how can we be earlier in the conversation so that rather than they come to us with an idea fully formed, as we've had in the past, tends not to work when a brand's come up with an idea. So how can we be involved earlier in that process? How can we then work with our commissioners and the producer so that we're all kind of in at the start, because that's just going to deliver a better chance of A, getting something away and getting it onto screens, but B, of more parties being satisfied or happy with the outcome.
And we're also talking against the backdrop of perhaps the most successful ever piece of branded content that's just come out, which is the Barbie movie, obviously. I wonder, are you expecting a Barbie effect at ITV, do you think?
It's interesting that Barbie's kind of become the tentpole for this, because obviously we've had the Lego movie a few years ago, which I think was a brilliant example as well. And in fact, Lego have done a brilliant job with things like Lego Masters, which is in lots of territories around the world. This is not a new phenomenon, and there is something in those brands that lends itself to that kind of storytelling. That's not going to suddenly swing FMCG, an FMCG brand to go, oh, I want to lean into content because I saw the Barbie film. So you have to pick the right brand, the right objectives, the right storytelling needs in order to achieve that kind of success.
So you talked about getting involved early on in the conversation, which is key. So producers that are listening to this who are finding it tough to get through the door in a regular commissioning process, maybe looking more towards branded content and brand-funded programming as an opportunity. For those businesses that haven't actually ventured into this space before, what would be your advice? How could they work with ITV? What would you recommend? An established producer's never worked in brand-funded programming before. How should they go about pitching to you? Do they need to come in for a meeting with a brand, say, we've already got a certain amount of funding with a creative idea? Or should they just come to you and build a relationship with you, and then you can work with them on finding the right brand? How does it work? How does that process work?
Sure. Again, it's worked in a variety of ways in the past. I think going forward, the first thing is commissioner still needs to love the idea. So it's idea driven. The editorial standards that we have as a business are high, and so it has to work from a commissioning perspective as a starter. If commissioner says love it, but this is one that will need funding, then it very much his next step is to come and speak to me and my team so that we can work out whether it's viable as a proposition from an ad funding perspective. So we have a quick sense of what are advertisers looking for in the current climate, what's a realistic budget that we might be able to pitch for, what kind of slot is going to appeal to different categories of brands. We don't have a specific formula, and it's a bit part science, part art, but we can put a lens through it where we think that it's got a chance or not got a chance. And then we definitely want to be leading the conversation with brands. So we would far rather be in charge of that part of the process. We have relationships with hundreds of brands, and it's important for us that we're very much kind of leading that dialogue. We know things can bubble up in different ways at times, so if that ever happens, just loop us in as early as possible so we can be part of that conversation.
Can you give us an idea of a project that a commissioner's really likes, but the decision that it's made that it's got to be brand funded, or it might have to be more of a commercial conversation? What are the sort of factors that lead to that decision being made, whereas they like the idea, but maybe it's not one for an outright commission?
There are key slots and parts of the schedule or risks that we might want to take, and it's those kind of dynamics that lead you to an outcome of we like it, but it needs funding. So I think there's a slot in daytime, which we've identified as, ideally, if that slot could be funded, that would free up money for other parts of the schedule. So that's an opportunity we've identified. And we've worked then with commissioning and with key labels to come up with formats that we're actively taking to market to see if we can help find funding for those slots. So that's one example. Another example is, and I have to be careful what I say because we haven't announced anything externally yet, but we've got a format idea for ITVX first. It would go out on ITV1 as well, but it's an ITVX first idea, and it is in a genre that is not one that ITV traditionally plays in. So it feels quite risky, but actually from a brand perspective, it feels really exciting, and it feels different to anything else we've got on ITV, and it's at the perfect time of year, I think, to approach certain categories of brands to see if they'd be interested in funding it. And the funding ask is not crazy either, so it's a modest ask. So that's one where we've kind of collectively got to a point where we think, you know what, actually we should pursue this, and we should see if we can find a brand for it. So that one's more to do with taking a risk and commissioning being concerned about how much money they put into something like that, which is understandable. And so therefore, can we work with a brand that de-risks it from a network perspective, but actually provides an incredible opportunity for a brand at perfect time of year.
And offers you an opportunity to maybe play in genres that you don't usually play in.
Precisely, and that's one of the things ITVX has allowed us to do in a more general way. We've leaned heavily into comedy, which is a genre we hadn't really pursued for ITV in volume, but we've done that, and we've been able to do that because of ITVX, and it gives us a bit of creative flexibility. So this is another example of being able to do that.
Final question is, funding coming into programming is often led by trends in the marketplace as well. Now, in this current cost of living crisis, we're seeing more and more people perhaps eating in as opposed to going out to restaurants, and various different changes in consumer habits. Is that something that producers should put a bit of homework in understanding where the market is, not only right now, but perhaps where it's going to be in 6 months into their development process? Should they be thinking more as a marketeer at this point in time, as opposed to purely just an ideas-led business?
I would actually say it's slightly longer term, given the timelines of trying to find funding for a project, then create the show. I would say it's probably minimum 6 months, maybe even 9 months to a year out. So that's the period you're trying to look at. I absolutely think thinking like a marketeer is really helpful for producers. So there's a part which goes, be a producer, do what you do best, which is make great content. So come up with great ideas, focus on that. The bit about thinking of a marketeer is just try and understand what a marketeer is trying to achieve and why they might invest in a show. And that's just a helpful lens, even if it's as simple as thinking about what additional assets can I create around the show. So instead of just thinking about the show, what else could I add in that would help a brand out? So if you're a marketer, you're going to have to go and justify this to somebody in procurement or a finance person, and that's not necessarily going to be straightforward to do. So how can we help them do that? That said, and of course the cost of living crisis is not something we should ignore, for most brands who are looking into this area, they want to be entertaining. They want to be creating that emotional connection that you mentioned earlier. And so it might be slightly less about focusing on some of the tougher things that are going on in life and providing something more that is offering a bit of escapism or something a bit more aspirational. That can be a way of approaching it as well.
Okay. Finally, Bhav, you're on a session here at Edinburgh TV Festival. Tell us a bit about that.
Sure. So it's a panel which has the title Unbranded Content. It's being run by Brad Dargent from Ancestry. And essentially, Ancestry have had a great relationship with the production of long-form programming over a number of years, both as a kind of almost prop placement partner. Who they have obviously great technology and great database that has helped make some fantastic shows with ITV. DNA Journeys is a great example of that. They've sponsored shows over a period of time, so they understand things from that perspective, and they're also funding programming. So Brad was really keen to open up a conversation to showcase kind of what they've done, but to show how brands can develop a relationship with programming in a light touch way that really adds value to the viewer and isn't about putting the brand at the foreground of the activity. And so that's kind of what the panel discussion is going to be about. It's a really fascinating area for me because absolutely the idea, the content, the entertainment of the show, thinking viewer first, the brand presence should be authentic. There should be a trusted relationship between the brand and the audience. All of that is key. But equally, in a tough ad market where this is discretionary spend that we're having to go after, how do you make it help that content deliver compelling ROI for the brand? Because ultimately they need to shift brand awareness, they need to shift perception of their brand, and they need to sell product. How can you achieve that in this landscape? And I think that's a really interesting area to explore.
Yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it, really? And I guess it must be a tough sell for a marketeer, a marketing director, taking such an idea to his or her board when they're thinking, okay, we're not going to have overt branding. This is going to be something much deeper. I guess there's challenges to overcome on and perceptions to overcome on both sides there.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a bit of a leap of faith that the marketer has to, really passionately believe in the idea, and whoever's kind of making the internal decisions within that business has to trust in their marketing team and their marketing department. A great example is Sherry Crammond at M&S and Cooking with the Stars show. That has worked phenomenally well for M&S's business, where we've just done Series 3 on air. And that's just somebody who passionately believed in an idea, understood how she could take that TX opportunity and make it live and breathe through her entire business. And that's where she was able to justify the investment and show the ROI. It's not just what went out on there and the media value that generated, but it's also how you take that newly created brand and help it live and breathe through your entire business. So staff wearing aprons, signage in stores. And of course, M&S have all of that available to them, so they're able to do things that some other brands might not. But having that vision up front absolutely helps kind of get the buy-in within the business.
Yeah, well, it certainly works. I've got a couple of Cooking with the Stars carrier bags under my sink at home, so the brand's made its way into my house in many ways. So, Bhav, thank you very much for your time. It's really fascinating speaking with you, and good luck with your panel.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. And yeah, anybody who wants to talk about ad-funded programming, give me a shout.
So my final guest on this week's Edinburgh TV Festival special show is Jane Root, CEO of Nutopia. Jane, hello, how are you doing?
Hi there, I'm doing good.
Good. I'd like to start by asking you about things at Nutopia, what you've been working on recently and what's coming up.
Our thing is working particularly with big, giant movie stars and A-list, scarily big people. We're out there in the world finishing up one giant show and starting a couple of others. So that business is still happening. We've also got a really great documentary series on Netflix that is going to be coming up in the next couple of months, and we're hard to work at lots of things. We're busy, but it's tough out there.
It is. I'm going to come on and ask you a little bit about that in a second. So one of the biggest shows you've done recently is the Chris Hemsworth's Limitless show. Tell us a little bit about how that came about and how you've really sort of developed this whole subgenre of the megadoc and working, as you say, with A-list talent and bringing them into the documentary space.
The beginning of it goes back to when I worked for the BBC at BBC Two and then at the Discovery Channel, where I was always impressed by how few big ideas you got offered and how many small ideas. And so I remember doing a piece of work at the BBC where we compared what we called our channel-defining ideas with the other ideas. And there were often one or two to choose between, sometimes zero. And we had to make them up ourselves. Whereas things like feature docs, there were often 25 really great ones, and it was kind of random which one you chose. And so when we started Nutopia, my focus was on the really big ones. I knew from my experience as a broadcaster there was a big gap.
And that presumably coincided with a lot of the streamers, the development of SVOD, and their desire for tentpole programming.
In a world perhaps where you have 3 or 4 terrestrial broadcasters, tentpoles are still really important, but with the amount of stuff out there and the demands on people's time and attention growing kind of exponentially, the need to stand out and the need to be able to have a big proposition for the audience has grown enormously.
And your background has been running a number of different channels, both in the UK and the US. That must have helped you understand what a channel-defining documentary show means to a network.
Yeah, at the BBC, we used to do 3 press conferences a year, and you had to stand up and have 1 or maybe 2 things that people in the audience would like. And if you did that, then you were a successful channel controller. And if you didn't, then you were in misery. I learned that lesson pretty quickly, that everything had to be about a very small number of very big things. And that's been my mantra all the way through for myself and other people, because really big things are usually really difficult things. And you're putting the bar high, you sometimes struggle to get over the top of it.
One of the talking points at Edinburgh has, rather unsurprisingly, been about the downturn in TV market in terms of commissioning, shows that are being commissioned, particularly, I think, unscripted, but I think scripted is probably coming down the line a little bit for scripted. How are you seeing the change of buying patterns for both the streamers and the linear broadcasters over the last 6 months or so?
Well, in the US where I live, the evaporation of several buyers has been a big thing. You know, CNN closing down its documentary department was a big thing. Discovery being folded into Warner Discovery was a big thing. You're also seeing some of the smaller channels like Smithsonian go away completely. The more buyers you lose, that has an impact. You're also seeing the shift from people thinking about just getting people to watch their streamers and sign up to actually it being profitable. There's been a major kind of mind shift. And before, nobody really knew what worked on a streamer, and now it's out of its adolescence, and it's like someone who's left home and they have to pay for the mortgage and their phone bill, and they're suddenly like watching every penny, whereas previously life was a bit lovely and wishy-washy, and who knew, and your parents were probably going to pay in the end anyway.
The commissioning boom that COVID, I think, helped fuel as well, because everybody was at home, everybody was consuming more and more content. Do you think the turbulence that we're seeing in the market now is a result of now the sort of the downslope of that, if you like? We're on the other side of that commissioning boom, and also we're seeing lots of different things, inflation and cost of living crisis, all the rest of it. How do you think the market is going to change over the next 18 months, for example?
I think there's a realignment going on. People are prioritizing much more clearly. You can see the streamers trying to get rid of having so many shows that nobody watches but are actually good shows, which I think is a real issue. I think when there was only Netflix and they could rely on that algorithm, which they were justifiably very proud of, that doesn't work anymore where you've got 5 different streamers or 7 or whatever. People dipping in and out of, I'll be there for a month and then I'll go until the next thing that comes along. I think that's a fundamental change in how the streamers operate, which they still haven't really sorted out. You are seeing a crunch in terms of what do we have to spend? How many different shows can we have? I think those things are leading to a reassessment and realignment. I'm old enough that I've seen this happen periodically, and then things settle down. I think what you have to do is not panic. You have to be tough about, do things really have to be as expensive as they are? We have been through a boom time, right, where kind of nobody really knew what anything cost. We were in a, all-you-can-eat buffet. And I think it's strictly a la carte now, right? And you've got to pay for everything. I mean, the shows that we make, we're still managing to sell big, expensive shows, but there is a lot more focus on how exactly are you spending the money.
Inflation is no doubt affecting your production costs as well, so that must create added pressure at the commissioning stage or certainly during production.
Everything's got more expensive at the same time when everybody wants to spend less, and that's a kind of squeeze in the middle. It really is. And people are needing to be, including us, you need to be inventive about how you respond to that. It's not a think of an idea and then cost it scenario anymore. It's think of a clever, surprising idea which can be made at a price that people can afford.
When we come to programming, I'm really interested to look at, say, 3 bands of programming within the script. You've got the Megadoc and the tentpole projects that you specialise in that we talked about. And then we've got the more regular sort of unscripted programming, and then you've got budget at the bottom. Which of those bands do you think are more pressured at the moment? The streamers are always going to look for tentpole shows, I would imagine. It's very important for their shows to stand out. But do you think it's the producers that are specialising in budget or that mid-range that are more at risk at the moment?
It's always the middle that gets squeezed. I think historically that's always what happens. It's the ones in the middle can go smaller. And that's really hard for the people making those shows. But that's where the pressure comes. If you're already making a budget show, you've built budget into your thinking. You had a budget idea and then you work at that. And those things are really hard to make with very little leeway for anything going wrong. But if you create a cost-effective show, you know what you're doing. I think it's the middle area where it's just hard. I think life is hard for a lot of people, really. And the margins, the pressure on production fees, the pressure on, what you could get a broadcaster to pay for. We really are aware of the pressure not to pay for executive producers, even if they're working 3, 4, something goes wrong 5, 6, 7 days a week on a project. Broadcaster doesn't pay, the production company has to pay. In most cases, not all, but in a lot of cases. And that's really hard on most companies.
Yeah, I was actually speaking to somebody last night about overspend, and when a producer is working on a project and for whatever unknown reason, the spend goes over budget, and often the commissioner will turn around and say, well, that's our budget, that's the lot, you're going to have to suck it up. I mean, it must be an incredibly stressful production process for many people, especially now when they're spending months on a production and they're seeing their margin disappear as they go.
Been there, and it's really tough when it happens. It's one of the reasons that you have to build up your reserves. You have to make sure that those rainy days do come, and less likely to get an umbrella from a broadcaster. You really are. And it all depends on relationships and on whether they think that they in any way contributed to the problem. And occasionally people will come through, but it's tough. It's really tough.
And finally, Jane, you've worked on running channels and we said obviously running Nutopia. What advice would you give to the indies that perhaps in that middle band that we talked about? What advice would you give them at the moment when things are looking quite bleak? I mean, there are certain aspects, certain reasons to be cheerful in 2024. I think there's talk about ad revenue starting to come back to the market. But right now, what would you be your words of wisdom?
Batten down the hatches, make sure, look at every budget, be really, really make sure that you have got room for that rainy day, because they do come. So be really super careful about that and still take risks. The worst thing that you can possibly do is, and I'm speaking, having heard Louis speak so eloquently last night, is the worst thing to do is to start trying to be safe, because that'll kill you. Audiences still want risky, surprising projects. And so you have to cling on to that risk thing and as hard as you possibly can. So don't try and go safe, because that's not going to help. And finally, as much as I support the writers and the directors in America, hope they keep striking for a very long time.
Jane, thank you very much. That's really great to speak to you. Thanks for coming on Telecast. Let's talk about very quickly about your panel. Tell us about which one you're appearing on here at Edinburgh.
I'm on the documentary panel, and we're talking about how documentaries get made and what the future is for that genre. And we're also going to be talking about whether you should pay your contributors, which I think is a big issue, and whether the streamers who pay for access with things like Drive to Survive, whether that is skewing the market or not. I personally think that there's room for lots of different types of program making to survive, but they probably all shouldn't be called documentaries. Unscripted is my favourite phrase to describe that part of the world.
Jane, well, it sounds fascinating. I'll be there following that. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, that's about it for this week's telecast. It's good to be back. Just a quick note to let you know that the super early bird ticket offer for the Telecast Digital Content Forum in November expires on the 31st of August. So if you're keen to snag the cheapest ticket deal, be sure to buy before the deadline. This week's telecast was edited by Ian Chambers and recorded in Edinburgh. We'll be back with another show, same time, same place next week. Until then, stay safe.